Good afternoon. I'm Ajit Sinha. I'm a professor at the School of Public Policy here at APU. As you know, Professor Chandan Gaura usually chairs these colloquiums, but today he had to go out of town, so I'm standing up for him. Excuse me. I have to catch my breath here. Okay, so it is indeed a great pleasure and honor for me to be introducing today's lecturer, Professor Amit Bhaduri. Professor Bhaduri has been one of the leading intellectuals of India since as far as my memory goes. This is not a comment on his seniority, but rather an acknowledgement of the fact that he has been a leading intellectual light of the country since a very young age. When I was young, and I'm talking about the ancient period of 1970s, one of the standard paradigms of understanding and analysis of rural development and poverty was the model of semi-feudal production relation. This was a young Bhaduri's original contribution. Professor Bhaduri is perhaps even better known internationally than at home. This is because his main work in economics are theoretical in nature, and in India, unfortunately, we don't care much about theory. His main theoretical work is in the area of growth economics. His contribution in collaboration with Harvard-based scholar Stephen Margling on a growth model in the tradition of Keynes and Kaleski is considered pioneering work, and he is still developing and refining it. So no wonder, a few years ago, he was honored by the prestigious Leontief Award given by Tufts University annually for significant and lasting contributions to development economics. Professor Bhaduri's recent concerns about wealth transfers in the name of land grants for industrial and developmental purposes and concern for interlocking of inequalities has similar potentials as his early work on semi-feudal production relation. A serious theoretical paradigm is in making for understanding the nature of modern poverty and concentration of wealth and inequality. As most of you perhaps already know, he has taught in many leading institutions in India, such as Delhi School of Economics, JNU, etc., as well as many leading universities around the world. Till yesterday, he was a professor emeritus at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, an honor that he relinquished in protest of the recent JNU incidents. Yet again, with great pleasure, I invite Professor Bhaduri to deliver his lecture.
Most of what Ajit has said is not, I would not say is untrue, but is rather exaggerated. And except one, that is, until yesterday I was a professor emeritus and I am no longer. That is absolutely true. Now, I think there are too many people standing at the back. There are some chairs here. Well, you know, the reason I decided I was rather keen to speak to a group of people, to a group of young scholars from different areas of social sciences is for a particular reason. Is the mic all right? Can you hear? The reason why I wanted to say it is because towards the end, I will come to something after telling the usual, theoretical structure involved and so on. But towards the end, I want to try out an idea which has been going on in my mind for many years. And I think for the first time, I'm beginning to see, and partly because of all this, some of my former students in JNU, who are now student leaders, many of whom you have seen on the TV and so on. But you see something which is going on which we do not understand about it in India. And I'm going to say something about it at the end, but let me not spoil the detective story by saying the conclusion in the beginning. You see that today's talk is basically about, it started with what? Professor Sinha, Azim, which Azim basically said that it started with when I did my first so-called field work. It was not meant to be a field work. I had given up my job and so on. And I was just traveling to the villages. This was in the early 1970s. And I was collecting impressions about why, people are so poor and so on. It was mostly in Bengal and a little bit in parts of what used to be Bihar at that time. Now, this became in academic circles, including with some of my colleagues and so on. I was myself never involved in the debate. But what came to be known among the Marxists as a mode of production debate, feudalism, capitalism, and so on. Now let us start from there. I don't want to get into I don't get into any debates, as a matter of fact. So let me start from, if you look at the pure prototypes, which is always the way to do theory, that you look at a pure form, Plato's pure form, to understand what you are talking about. So think of a pure prototype of what is called feudalism and what is called capitalism. Now with both of these, you have two characteristics. Assuming that I would not go into all this, assuming that there is a surplus to be extracted from the direct workers, okay, over and above what they produce. Let us not go into the theory of what that means and so on. A surplus to be extracted. This kind of a prototype in pure form would mean with feudalism, there is a particular kind of property which is associated, which is land. Typically we think of it as land. With capitalism, at least since Marx, we think of this as capital. But as we soon began to realize that this is not really quite enough. Because you see, if you think of capital, it is not only something which helps you to produce, land is also something which helps you to produce, but it is also a property right. Okay? I mean, most of you know it. If you don't know this exactly in this form, you know it in another more commonsensical. So you have a specific form, physical, tangible form, which is land, a physical, tangible form, which is, let us say, some machines or raw materials, and you have the property right on it. According to that property right, it is distributed. So even in the pure form, say if you have land, and if I'm really arguing like a proper historical materialist, Marxist, or whatever word you want to say, I would say that, well, it's true, you have tangible land. But you see, when this land is not being cultivated by the direct producer, but by somebody else, and the rent is being given, it becomes a form of capital. Similarly with capital. So it is not simply a tangible form, it is a tangible form of asset, but it is also the function it performs as a, for distribution purpose. Economic theory, including the high-flown economic theory of today, in whatever form you take it, has not been able to reconcile these two completely. Between the distributional function of tangible capital and the production function of tangible capital. These two, and whenever people have tried to, Professor Ajit Sinha works in this area, whenever you try to combine them, you get into all kinds of logical dilemmas, logical contradictions, and so on, which is known as a capital theory debate. But leave that out. Now, this gives me, when I wanted to do the field, well, I did not want to do the field work, but when I started thinking about the notes which I had collected, it soon became clear that this is precisely what happens in almost every time in real life. I mean, in a broad sense, we say that, feudalism and capitalism are mixed. It is a semi-feudal, it's a semi-capitalist, transitioning to capitalism, transiting to whatever kind of, words. But one of the things when you actually go and observe something, what you see is something much simpler. You see that because you have the ownership right intermingled with the physical property, physical tangible capital, physical tangible means of production, the two together can be mixed in very many different ways. And this is what we call, and with somebody who is now no longer alive, one of my colleagues at JNU, Krishna Bharadwaj, and also some others outside India. But since we were in JNU, this is one of the things which you see, that when you actually look at data, she was actually looking at data, I was not really looking at data, I was collecting my impressions to sort out my politics, to be very honest. Now, if you put these two together, you simply begin to see that in real life, you almost never see a pure form of, ownership and tangible capital. And this is what you call interconnected modes of exploitation, to give it a high term. Or interconnected because, think for example Azim Premji, the university here. Now, Mr. Azim Premji would not have only one kind of capital ownership from which the company makes profit. It will be very many forms. Think of anybody else. These are big companies, it is understandable. But think of my example of a small local, what we used to call sort of jotedar, that is somebody who is in the Bengal context, also in part of eastern Bihar, that these are people who actually own some land, give the land out for rent, okay, and they also, at the same time, they lend money and also get some interest. So it is money lending. Their income partly comes from money lending, partly comes from ownership of the land. Okay, somebody else might have it with some other form of capital and so on, but the idea is quite clear. One of the things which I did, and on which there was a big debate in the 1970s, which was that depending on, if the same group of people have this ownership pattern, overlapping ownership pattern, say for example they are also lending land, they are also renting out land, getting a land rent, and giving, giving loan, okay. And the loan is given to the poor peasant who is actually working on his land, which was very, very common in Bihar, which was very, very common in Bengal. And I'm told it was, I have not been there, in parts of Bundelkhand, somebody did a PhD with me recently, and so on and so forth. In Andhra, everywhere you have had something of this sort, at least around the time when I used to think about these problems. Now, then it is quite possible, and I'll tell you a story rather than a lecture. It is quite possible that if you really, for some reason, if the land becomes more productive, let's say irrigation comes in a big way, land becomes more productive, then it is quite possible the peasant would not need so much of loan, consumption loan. He would not be so poor, would not need so much of consumption loan. And it is not to your interest unless economically speaking, unless from production you get so much more, that you're losing your rent, losing your interest income does not matter. I came across this idea. It was not my own idea. You see, when I was traveling in the village, I can't stop telling this story because it is actually how the idea occurred to me, and that is where I think there is an element of truth in it. Not just truth for economic journals and so on and so forth, but actually in what happens. I fell ill, and I had very high fever and so on. I didn't have a place to stay. I was sitting somewhere under a tree. And one of the local rich peasant, not rich, but by local standard rich, peasant came and told me, sir, not sir, but he could see I was not a local. From everything it was very clear I was not a, peasant. So he took me home and he said, you come and, you were very sick. And I immediately went with him. And then in a couple of days, I recovered and so on. And before I came, as is the custom, I was coming, he said, no, you were my guest. You cannot leave without eating. So I sat down to eat, and he gave some, puri, luchi, and some, vegetable and so on. And while I was eating, his wife was serving, and I noticed that she had so much of gold bangle here. So I told him that, I didn't tell him that, why so much gold you were just wasting like this. I told him that, I saw that there is a lot of, cauliflower, which you grow, but you only grow it once. Why don't you irrigate the land properly? And then you will get much more from the land itself. And surely you can afford to sink a tube or two, because that I was sure by seeing the gold. He said, you see, I can't do this because of my brother. I can't do it because my brother-in-law my brother-in-law lends money here. I didn't see the connection at that time. I came back and later it struck me that what he meant is that it would be an anti-brother-in-law activity if he increases his production. And that is how my idea was born of interconnected modes of exploitation. That, you take two modes of exploitation, and if both of them are together, and this was an article which I published, which Ajit was referring to. It was never my intention to actually even write an article, but when I became a professor and so on, I decided that I might as well write it up. Now, this is how the thing was started. Now, there is one thing which is important in this kind of discussion. That is, if you notice this, you will find that it is two types of exploitation, but both are taking place through sort of market and in terms of money. Not always. Occasionally you pay in terms of, the less there is a market, the less there is so-called commercialization and so on, the more you will have some of the payments which is in kind and some of the payments which would be in money. As a matter of fact, there is a very, very nice book. Some of you, if you do economic history or sociology, I think it is one of the, at least I found one of the most, insightful books on feudalism, which was by a gentleman, Polish economic historian, Witold Kula, called, Economic Theory of Feudalism or something like that. But you see, anyway, what he says are things that so long as the market does not come in, how interestingly non-monetary things become important. And if any of you come from a village, you will immediately see what I mean. That you come and work on my family on the days of when there is a festival, or just do this thing. These are assumed because you see that labor you partly pay in forms of labor. It extensively exists in, even today, I'm talking about last year, it exists extensively in Bundelkhand, one of the poorest regions of UP. That you have from the Mughal times, you have the Kutkast system, by which you are given land, you work on there are big landlords, unirrigated land, they give you some land, but they tell you that at the time of the peak of the harvest, your first call is to come and work on my land at the time of harvesting, at the time of sowing, so on and so forth. They have to come and do it first on the land for so many days, and then they can work on the land which has been given to them. And this was the traditional East European serfdom. And it was a traditional Mughal Kutkast system. And it is the traditional Indian UP Bundelkhand even today, for 6 months. Anyway, so you had this particular thing, so how much you pay and in what form you pay, and there are different ways in which you can exploit and so on, it can go on in this. So you can actually have things like two types of exploitation which you can think of, two types of exploitation which you can think of. One type of exploitation which is entirely through the market, the sort of stuff which Marx talked about, for example, which today in Yale, that man, what's his name? Romer has a book, a general theory of exploitation, he talks about. But these are all markets, and with the market you have an exploitation based on the market, and if different markets may be interconnected. We have an Indian economist who also worked, two. One recently died, T.N. Srinivasan, and the other after my work, trying to say that this is not correct. And the other is Pranab Bardhan, who also tried to. But you see, they are talking of a kind of exploitation which essentially is market-based. And if the commercialization is not complete, you can also have not totally market-based exploitation, but direct, personal, in which you have to pay in terms of labor, you have to pay in terms of, in feudal Europe, you have to pay in terms of timber, because there was no market for timber, but you could say that carry so much timber to the other man, and so on and so forth. Now, when I started thinking about, then I left all this and so on, but when recently, when some of my students and, in all this, elections and talking about, when they talk about Azadi, I talked to a few of them, and one of the things which they say is, of course, Azadi, freedom from different things. You must have seen it, Kanhaiya Kumar saying Azadi, and Omar, and so on and so forth. Now, and there is nothing wrong, by the way. I'm just saying that, but if you try to really, if you as a social scientist, you really try to think about what is there that is, we can add to this, or we can more clearly see. I started thinking about it, that was quite some years ago, because I knew some of these people, and because they had, somebody wrote a thesis in which there are three modes of exploitation. Azadi, three types of Azadi which are very important. One is, given the current climate in India, they will immediately say, look, this is why we want to close down JNU. Now, there are three types of things which they talk about. One is Azadi from patriarchy, or what in simpler terms you'd call gender discrimination. One, caste Azadi from Monubad, which is not only, the patriarchy part of Monubad. If you have read Ambedkar, you would also know that part. And the third is the Marxist kind of exploitation, which is based on some ownership of property. And it is, unless you are totally dogmatic, it should be quite clear to you that one of the reasons why traditional Marxists made so little impact, I'm saying even in terms of understanding the society, is precisely because class and everything else follows from class. You know, that basically you say, why are you talking about caste, for example? Most of the people, you go to Bihar, if you take the agricultural workers, they are scheduled caste. Yes. Now to this you can, and they are, Balmics, they are, if you take scavengers, this is very finely, these are graded. But they are all non-upper caste, so-called non-upper caste Hindus. So they would say that, the assumption is that if you talk of class, from which all the other things follow. I mean, this is, if you travel in villages, you immediately see this is not true. I mean, I knew it in 1973. I didn't have a way of theorizing it. I still don't have. But it is true that there is a rich poor based on exploitation, market-based exploitation. There is an exploitation which is based on gender. I mean, in Bihar, for example, I have seen myself, I have talked to 2 women very poor from Brahmin family, very high caste family, but they are unable to say that. So I said, and they have land. So I said, why you have land and why? Well, they are not allowed to cultivate it. As women, they are not allowed to cultivate it, and when they are not allowed to cultivate it, the people who have given the land to, they are even not allowed to come out to the field to supervise it. So very soon, according to them, the land has been taken away, and that is why they are so poor. The land exists in their name, but they get nothing from the land. Now, you can call it a caste, but it is also a gender-based kind of thing, and which is very, very prevalent in Bihar and UP. I mean, it is also there elsewhere. I could tell you many stories, but anyway, there is one gender-based, one property-based, class-based, and one based on, which is the Indian speciality caste. In America, it would be something like a racial thing, but probably not exactly totally overlapping, but there would be things of this sort. Now, the question I asked is, while in discussion it has always been either you reduce it all saying that it is all class, or it is all caste, like, Lohia, or it is all class like the Marxists, or it is all, well, with gender you cannot quite do it, but you start by saying that that is the primary one. Unless you do this, is there a way in which you can think of them as interlocked modes of exploitation? Can you, to a certain extent, think of them as something which is reduced? And this is what I wanted to say, that this is my detective story. I wanted to tell you that I think I might have found an empirical way. I'm too old to do it myself, but some of the younger, I'm sure there are 8, 10 PhD theses which can be done out of this. There are very many papers can be written, if this idea is broadly okay. The idea is like this, and in some cases you usually call it also identity. Identity as gender, identity in terms of etc., etc. You read Amartya Sen and there are pages and pages of this. But simply put, think of this as a structure, that every identity, say for example caste, let us not use big words. Take for example caste. You have people of very high caste and people which are of very low caste. This is a socially constructed high caste, low caste category which exists. Religion, it has now become, you have the majoritarian religion and you have the non-majority religion, and you try to, one of the attempts is to hierarchy them. You can do it with many, many things. Whenever you think of an identity and you socially construct an identity, you do not construct an identity with the sense of just belonging. This is a liberal fallacy. You do a notion of identity because you want to say that I am better than you. I mean, it's not only now going on in India, this is always the case. It's true history. Now, if you take, say, for example, caste, you can say, rather than caste, you can take religion, rather than religion, you can take, something else. But suppose I take caste. You have high caste, okay? And suppose, and I reduce everything to income because I don't know how else not to do it, to get a, neat measure. You see, my luggage got lost yesterday coming, so I couldn't bring the paper. But if some of you are interested, I will send it to you tomorrow. I'm just speaking from what I remember. But I've thought about it, so it is not so bad. Now, if you look at the high caste, and suppose the high caste has an income, average income of 50. Okay. And if you take the low caste, suppose you take the low caste has an average income of, let's say, 20. Okay. So you have a difference of income between the high and the low, which is 30. Okay. Now take the richest group and the poorest group in the society, that is class. You take the richest group and the poorest group in the society. Suppose the difference between them, income is, say, 100, or take a number 60. Here, on the caste-based discrimination gives you 30. The other one gives you 60. 60 is the maximum which you can get. What in simple statistics you will call the range. So you take the range and you take this particular caste base, which is 30. You do a similar one on gender, but only gender. So take most privileged women, whatever it is, most of you here, and very, very poor, underprivileged group. And you take the difference between them. Suppose the difference is again 20. Then again, out of 60, which is the maximum range of difference, you have 120, 130. Now you think of a way of converting it, and for this you require a little bit of probability theory. You mix these two, and if you say that what is the probability of my feeling deprived, okay? If I belong either to I belong to a disadvantaged gender, or if I belong to a disadvantaged caste, okay? Or I belong to a disadvantaged religion. All these are socially constructed, what is advantage, disadvantage, but given this, suppose I take this. Now what is the disadvantage? One is you are 30 out of 60, half, so you take the other half, which is the disadvantage. In one case it was 20 out of 60, so you take the disadvantage, which is 4 out of 40%, one is 50%, and the intersection set of the two, which is 0.4 into 0.5, which is 0.2, which you take minus out, and you get a number, which in this case would be 7, I think. 70% of the people, or 70% of the people who would be disadvantaged, the probability of being disadvantaged either in terms of caste, I could do this in simple algebra, but if any of you are interested, later you can ask me, when I go back, you can ask me and I'll forward it to you with your email. You can calculate what is the total disadvantage of being in a caste, the total disadvantage of, let's say, caste, gender, and anything else, religion, whatever you want to put in, you can take all of this. And you can work out a common denominator. Now, if you do that, what is the assumption you are making? One assumption you are making is, like in all statistics, which I would not go into now, is that you are taking the average. The average is fairly good representation, and it will be a fairly good representation if it is normally distributed, etc., etc. but that we can leave it to the statisticians to check. But most of the normal cases, the error term would be, the standard deviation and so on would be given. You can work this out. But the assumption is that you have people who are averagely disadvantaged by, let us say, 60%, and others are distributed around it. So I take that lot, the whole lot. Some in that group would be more disadvantaged, some less. I take that group. I take another group of women where some are more disadvantaged, some are around the average. I take that lot, and it is the average of all these averages which I take, and I get an average deprivation index based on very many different classes. The real problem of this is it is a problem of economic reductionism. That is, to do this, I have to reduce everything to disadvantage in terms of money, disadvantage in terms of how much income loss and so on. Actually, everything you do virtually, when you say family labor is used, you impute value to family labor in some sense. You do this. And that is you are reducing every exploitation. That is why I started by saying every exploitation you are making it an interlocked market-based exploitation. But not all exploitation are interlocked market-based. That is also very clear when you go out, because the loss of dignity, the loss of various things which happens when you are, for example, when you are treated, let us say like a scavenger in a small village, so on and so forth. That sort of disadvantage is usually much greater. I ended, even I think I wrote it in the paper, I can't remember, in the preliminary version which I have, that you see Einstein, I'm told, I have not seen it myself, Einstein in his Princeton, Institute of Advanced Studies, in his office, he had only one quotation on his, on a door when you enter. And that quotation said that if you hear it, it's a pun of words, but you will understand it. I don't know German well enough to be able to say it. But in English it is, all that can be counted do not count. Many that cannot be counted counts. That is, many of these dignity, loss of things which you cannot quantify counts, and many which you can count really are not that important. So once you remember that, it is true you get a limited reductionist view of total disadvantage, but it is still, I think it gives you something more than just, and I think it goes beyond just talking about mode of production, transition, so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have time for questions and answers, comments, whatever. Do we have mic? Mic?
They can come here.
Or you can come here if you want. Raise your hand. I think mic would be better. They will feel more comfortable just asking from where they are. There. Probably it's better that you stay here because you have to answer. Okay.
Hello, sir. Sir, as far as the current situation is concerned, going back to the 70s, there was, as you told, the debate of the mode of production. Going back to the 1970s, you told about the mode of production debate. So there was a debate between whether India is semi-feudal, semi-colonial, or is it a capitalist country or backward capitalist country. So at this point of time, what would be the economic relations of India that you can maybe have a final say on it? but like I'd get a perspective. And why would you say that it is so and so?
If there are more questions, shall I take a few together or shall I answer one by one? Well, you can sit down. Well, I think, your question partly, I think, is precisely to answer this question that I gave this lecture. That if you believe, I really don't know India well enough, I think, to say this kind of characterization, unless I'm being just dogmatic and put it that way. But I think one thing is certainly true, that there are many kinds of modes of exploitation which are not classical Marxist market-based. That is, they are not surplus labor or surplus value which is being, extracted or wage. I think this is certainly true of a very large part of India. I mean, recently I have been around, not everywhere, but I have been around to quite a few places about something else, which is land acquisition. And in that context, you can also see that there is so much of problem with that it is to, so you have what I have already said, you have, say, caste, which is very important, religion, which is very important, then gender, which is very important, all of which are sources of, can be used and is used for, and are used for exploitation, and of course property ownership of land, loan, defrauding banks, various things. Now, in this case, I think it is really rather wrong to say it is, because many of these things are cuts across traditional categories of feudalism, capitalism, and so on. I think it is wrong. I mean, if you say that it is semi-feudal or it is semi-capitalist or whatever it is, I think very often you tend to underplay this. And this is exactly what I was trying to say, that you try to underplay, and underplaying this very often is, I mean, you look at this, the importance of religion today, I mean, whether it should be or should not be is another matter. Whether you should call it, true consciousness or false consciousness is your decision. But one thing is certainly true, that you cannot ignore it. You cannot ignore the whole question of secularism. You cannot ignore the whole question of women's position, You cannot ignore, and once the fact that you have to take this into account, I think requires you to get out of this mode of production debate. I think to a large extent it's a false debate. It's a false debate because it is simply not, exploitation is simply not based on this, except in very special cases. Except in very special areas, except where the society is much more homogeneous, like in some tribal areas, like in some areas where the caste domination is so strong, like in parts of, even today in parts of Jharkhand and so on, that there probably it would make sense to make a mode of production, that this is the primary mode of exploitation, and around which I will define the mode of exploitation. But I think to make a more sweeping statement, the danger really is, and I became aware of this later, the danger really is that you forget other kinds of exploitation. So my answer, I don't have a straight answer to your question, but I don't think you can simply call it, I mean, would you call it India semi-capitalist? Huh?
Backward capitalist, you say.
Well, you can say it, but backwardness in terms of what? The backwardness precisely is in terms of not that India does not have the per capita income of United States, but it is also in terms of certain social characteristics that is what I'm trying to say. And those characteristics add to exploitation. America is a more backward capitalist country in that sense than, let us say, Scandinavia. Precisely for that reason. For its religious bigotedness, for its racism, so on and so forth. Yes. But you see, production relations, if you remember, I started by saying production relations are both the tangible factors involved, tangible capital involved, and the mode by which you distribute it. And the mode by which you distribute it, in a country like India, partly it comes in the form of gender. You know, there are enough studies, for example, that women in very poor families eat less than children and men. Very, very often. This is a well-known, finding. Now, very often, this kind of distributional aspects have to be taken into account. Gender, caste. Think of it openly. I went to this place, Una, just when where the people are flogged and so on. Just after that, we had gone there. Now, if you see there, you are forced to do only one kind of work. You see, the fact that you are forced to do only one kind of work means that, and if for some reason you say that this work would be much lower paid than, let us say, a professor, and a professor would be much lower paid than, let us say, I don't know, IT consultant, this is, you automatically make sure that these people are condemned to a higher rate of exploitation than I am. And when you say that the relations of production, if you really think the relations of production itself, the distributional aspect of it, actually involves these things. And this was, if you read, Critique of Political Economy, Marx says,
A contribution to the critique of political economy. A contribution to the critique of political economy.
I mean, if you will see that, distribution is essentially thought of in terms of the prototype of capital as defined under pure capitalism and ownership. But this is not the only way in which surplus is extracted. Unless you want to ignore what you see in reality in India, I think you have to make allowance for that. Anyway.
Okay.
We can debate it, but this is, I believe.
You see, the point I would like to add to that, the thesis you have presented is extremely interesting, and we will talk after that. But that, you see, you should not always think in terms of coining a term or giving a name to something that itself does not explain much, whether you call it backward, semi, this or that, unless you can articulate it theoretically. What he is trying to do is to suggest that, you see, the mode of production idea, that it is the whole way, the way we reproduce our material being in Marx, ultimately brings us into relationship with other human beings, and that is the fundamental in terms of understanding exploitation. He is saying that that's a limited way of looking at it. It leaves a lot of exploitative relations out. You are not able to incorporate that. Marxists do try, like, well, gender, this, that, everything can be incorporated in that because it's part of capitalism. We all know history, and we know that these things have been there before capitalism came into being. But anyway, it's not my lecture, so let's take some other questions. Questions or comment or anything? You have something.
So one way of looking at this concept exploitation, it's also a descriptive concept. It's not just judgmental or so. When you have certain kind of economic relationship where you extract surplus, this is what we call exploitation, and that's the way lots of Marxists have used this term. Yeah. So for other kinds of relationship, other kinds of we can use other terms like marginalization is another term, repression is another term. So maybe in gender context, it's not exploitation in that sense, in the classical Marxist sense. It's more like repression, it's more like oppression, it's more like, so the relationship between, say, the people living somewhere on the margin, say tribals in India, it's more like marginalized on the relationship between the rest of economic structure, and that structure is more based on marginalized and not so much on exploitation. So just some comment on that.
It's a good thing, and it's something which I have thought about because I have also been asked this before. The problem with, quite apart from constructing and deconstructing terms in postmodernist jargon, apart from that, I think the problem with terms like marginalization is they capture a whole set of phenomena, real phenomena, quite well. Just like, surplus extraction and so on also capture something which may not have an exact counterpart, but it captures a phenomenon which we want to describe. So does many other things in economics, like effective demand, this, that, and so on. If you have to say what, exactly, but they are good enough for at a certain level of understanding. But I think the problem with things like marginalization is, if you leave them as separate, that is what I ended by saying, reductionism. You see, one thing is to say that, well, you are marginalized, and you can also then take a view, like many people do, take a sort of romantic view and say, for example, some marginalized communities are much happier, much better off. You must have heard this, particularly with environment and global warming and so on. And I'm not denying that, this may be true. But then there is no connection between the two. It is not an interlocking. Then you say, there is a whole category called marginalization on the basis of certain things. There is a whole category called surplus extraction on the basis of certain things. Actually, like what he was saying, that, mode of production, but if you, I said interlocking because I want to see what is the interconnection between them. And to some extent, to see interconnection, you have to reduce them to either in the simplest case to a common denominator of, that is what I was saying towards the end in the lecture, or there are probably, I'm not very sure, but there are probably more a general way of doing this in terms of matrix algebra. But I have not still figured it out completely, but I'm almost sure that it can be done a little bit more generally. But the point is, if you really want to see the interconnection between them, you have to say something more than there is marginalization, this is what I very often find the problem in sociological description or in anthropological description. You see, there are too many separate, you describe, and there are too many separate categories. While economists make the mistake on the other side completely. But unless some comparability is established, it is like history. You can narrate a history, but unless some comparison is drawn, you can never see its relevance. At least that's my view.
So I understood from what you said, like market intrusion into rural production systems is to an extent obstructed by the feudalistic or whatever is remaining of that. And at the same time, we have heard about market intrusion doing the same widening of inequalities, and even the concept that you propounded, like forced commerce. So what are we trying to say? So market or not marketing, I mean non-market or market, what kind of mechanism will be good for Indian farmers? I mean, is that a combination possible for the small size that they are generally operating in?
Well, I think the answer comes in two parts. You see, first, the market, non-market thing is not only on the definition of the exploiter, it is also on the side of those being exploited. Think of the informal economy, the whole family working, you know. Somebody who does wage labor in the morning, works as a self-employed trader in the evening, you know, part of the time as a domestic worker. You see, everybody combines different modes of not only exploiting, but very often in India also being exploited. As soon as you think a little bit of the so-called informal sector, you will immediately see that it works on both sides. And if you try to put everything in the market, demonetization is one attempt at that. If you try to put everything in the market, you not only break many of these relationships on both sides, you know, you not only hit the informal economy and the poor, because they were also surviving on the basis of this informality, and I mean informality in the sense of allowing to be exploited and earning their income in different ways. I mean, if you have somebody who works at your home part-time, you go and ask her, and you will immediately find out that you know how many different types of exploitation in that locality they have. You know, cycle rickshaw puller and so on. So I don't think the answer is cut and dry, because you know, I mean, this was one of the mistakes of classical historiography. You don't move in a linear line towards less simple to more simple, and the modern economist fallacy that from the non-market to the market is the path to progress, or 6% growth is always better than 5% growth. You know, this sort of junk is really junk. I mean, I think you see the people who are there, for them it is how much surplus one side is going to get and how much surplus the other side is going to give up. And this calculation is the calculation not only of in terms of one mode of product exploitation, particularly in India and particularly in Indian politics. It is not in terms of one mode of exploitation, but in terms of several. You know, it became very clear to me also from another reason which I did not mention, because I was involved, I used to go around, I have also gone first with others in Narmada and so on, with Meda and so on, but also later with other people in land acquisition. Now you see, when the land acquisition thing came up, I mean, people are completely apolitical. I mean, I mean, you cannot imagine how apolitical they are. In Rajasthan, and they were for 19 days, I think, I can't remember, 17 or 19 days, they were sitting on the dharna. Or right now in Delhi, the women who are sitting on this Shalin Bagh or wherever it is on this, you know, they have crossed 30 days in terms of the, you know, resisting CAA and so on. You see, which contradiction has come up? Which mode of exploitation has come up? The fear of being exploited in terms of religion, marginalization in terms of religion, you know, and all the citizenship rights and so on, which will follow from that. In the case of land, most people, particularly women, said that, you know, if the land goes, our husbands will drink it up in 2 days and we'll have nothing left in Rajasthan, you know. But they are not talking politics, but they are talking of a mode of exploitation by which land will be taken away from them and the kind of exploitation they will be subjected to. So with each one of these, I think at least to begin to understand Indian reality is to start from saying that which mode of production is, or which mode of exploitation rather, which mode of exploitation is dominating where, under what conditions. And I think this is I don't mean this is a regional variation. I think this is really understanding how to make the politics. And you would be able to get something like unified politics, because still at the back of it, you will note that there is a general deprivation. And this is what I would like to calculate. I'm too old, I'm sure I would not manage to do it in my lifetime, but I think it would be done. And it would be something which is needed if things like notion of exploitation and so on has to become relevant in the Indian context.
Any other questions, comments? No? Well, thank you, Professor Bhaduri, for coming to APU. No, he was very, very generous with his time with us. It was a very short notice. And I would like to thank Chandan, because he did everything, and then in the end, let me take the credit. So Chandan basically deserves all the thanks for organizing it. He did it. Today he had to go out, so that's why I'm here. Okay, thank you very much for coming.